Well, good afternoon. Well, it really is a delight to be with you. I'm thoroughly enjoying my first visit to this fair country, and I'm looking forward to our time together, looking at the reliability of the Gospels. Can we trust the Gospels? But first, a bit of a commercial, just so I can get this off the stand. We produce a free magazine at Tyndale House in Cambridge, a couple of issues here, and we don't send it everywhere in the world freely, but it's freely available online. And so if you'd like to get this, it comes about 3 or 4 times a year. This is for people who want to get really serious about studying the Bible and knowing about the Bible, but we write it in a voice so that you can give it to people who aren't Christians, who just want to know about the Bible, trying to inform people. And I've got an article in there on the way people try to be skeptical about the Gospels. That's in an issue. And the latest Christmas issue on how people are skeptical about the Christmas stories and some of the evidence for those. So if you want to sign up to that, there are details about how to sign up at the back, or you can just go to tyndalehouse.com, C-O-M, and sign up. So the reliability of the Gospels. Well, when I wrote a book called Can We Trust the Gospels, I chose the title quite deliberately with the word trust in, because some people are looking for a sort of proof of the Gospels. So I didn't write Can We Prove the Gospels, because actually there's a bit of a problem with the word proof. It's used in different ways by different people, but in some of its most technical senses, it belongs, for instance, in mathematics. Now, mathematics is a bit of a game. Some people think it's a lot of a game. But what happens in mathematics is you agree some rules, and you sort of work your way through, and out pops something that's proven. As a form of philosophy called formal logic. Formal logic. It is as it sounds. It's formal and it's logical. It takes you through a set of steps. If you agree each of the premises, then the result pops out at the end, the conclusion. It's proven. People use prove in a different way in law, in courts. But when we talk about proving all sorts of things, we've got to remember that many of the things we most believe, we cannot prove that way. For instance, proving that someone loves you. How can you prove that someone loves you? I mean, try it. Whatever evidence you give that someone loves you, you could say, well, that's simply evidence that they're trying to manipulate you or whatever it is. You can always attribute another reason. You can't prove it. Prove, with a mathematical proof that anything has value. You can't really do that, and yet we assign value to things. The fact that you are here today means you've assigned a value of your time to be here. Every time you spend money, you're assigning value to something. But can you prove many of those things? No, you can't. But in life, we all trust. We get up in the morning. Most of us eat when we get up in the morning. Certainly drink when we get up in the morning. And you trust that it's not poison. You go to the supermarket, you buy things, and you're trusting people. We actually trust our lives daily to people, because humans are social creatures. God's made us to be social creatures, to depend on each other. Out on our own in the desert, we're not going to last very long. We need each other, which means that we are all wired to ask the question, and we're asking it all the time, should I trust this person? Should I not trust this person? You can sometimes get it wrong, but you can't avoid it. You can't avoid trusting people. If you avoid trusting people, you die. Very simply. So in other words, we all trust, and I'm asking the question of the Gospels, can we trust the Gospels? And I'm looking at that sort of personal form of trust. Are we able to do that? Now, sometimes we use the word faith, and that can be a slightly confusing term. Maybe a couple of 100 years ago in English, it used to mean something like trust. But now we find it's often used for blind belief with no reason. But actually the word faith comes from the Latin word fides, and fides simply meant trust. So when Christians historically have talked about trusting God and having faith in God, we don't mean blind belief with no reason contrary to your brain. God gave us the brain. So the examples we have of in the Bible of people trusting, someone like Abraham trusting, is not going against his brain that God gave him to think that, wow, God might be a lot bigger than him and may be able to deliver on his promises. He's actually going with the mind that God's given him. You see? And so trust, obviously, it's personal and it can go beyond what we can see. As Abraham, when he was promised a child, it went beyond what he could see. But it wasn't against what he knew because he'd met God. So when we're talking about faith and trust in the scriptures, I want to make sure that we're understanding it's something more like this. We often hear recommendations. You know, go to this restaurant, that's a good place. Buy this brand, that's good, that works. And we trust the people, and often we're not disappointed. That's a worthwhile recommendation. Lots and lots of people have found Christianity to be trustworthy, Jesus, the person, to be trustworthy, and the Gospels, which are about Jesus Christ, to be trustworthy. And I want to look at some of the historical reasons and evidence for that. Just a little bit about the Gospels. I'd encourage you to read them. They're only about 9 hours long. That's all 4 of them. Doesn't take long. Now, it's important to recognize when we get into history that history is sometimes stacked a particular way. History, as an academic discipline, works a particular way. Here is a famous academic who was one of the top scholars of the Second World War, Hugh Trevor Roper. He was a top scholar of modern history in Oxford University. One time someone came to him and they said, I think what we've done is we found Adolf Hitler's diaries. Now, he was a bit busy at the time. He didn't have long to look at them. So he said, well, just, send over the evidence you have and I'll have a quick look. And based on the quick look, he said, I think this could be genuine. He wasn't definite. He wanted to have a further look. But anyway, the headline went out, Hitler's diaries discovered. And the thing is, although this guy did loads and loads of careful work on history throughout his career, the one thing he's remembered for is having said that Hitler's diaries were genuine when in fact they turned out not to be genuine. So he got really badly stung as a historian for believing something that was false. On the other hand, there's another academic in Oxford around a similar time who, when he first heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls back in 1947-48, he said, I don't think that's genuine. That's just too big a discovery. I think it's fake. And of course, he turned out to be wrong. They were real. But his career didn't suffer. So we've got an interesting thing. That the academic discipline of history is set up so that if you believe something false, you're penalized, but if you don't believe something true, you're not penalized, right? And we're going to recognize when we're getting into the area of rational trust of the Bible, and we're talking about history and what can be shown, is that the scholars live in a world where they will be stung more for believing too much than they will be stung if they're skeptical. Skepticism pays and is protected by the system. Now, that's not how real life works. For instance, often in real life, we believe things based on a single testimony. Often there's only one witness to a crime. If someone's done something terrible against you, you may be the only witness. Someone does something terrible to a family member, they may be the only witness, and you trust them when they say this happened to me. So in life, we don't go on the basis of saying we only trust it when it's verified like a historian verifies things, okay? We don't do that. I'm not asking the question, can I satisfy a history department in a university that the Gospels are all true? I'm not asking that question. I'm asking a different question. I'm asking, can we show that they can rationally be trusted? Can they reasonably be trusted? With our minds properly working, can it be a good thing, a healthy thing with your mind to say, yeah, I believe that? That's what I want to look at. And I'm going to argue, yes, they can. So it's rational trust. What can be rationally trusted, not provable, and everyone has to trust someone. So let's start with some non-Christian sources. Now I want to start with non-Christian sources because often I find that's a common ground you can have with someone who's not a Christian. They can say, well, the Christian sources are biased, so give me some non-Christian sources. Well, that's why we're going to start here. And we're going to start with a few of the writings that we have. I want to start with a guy called Tacitus. Tacitus was a Roman historian, and he wrote a number of different works. These are they. He wrote a book about his father-in-law, Agricola. He wrote a history of Germany. Nice. He wrote some histories, and he wrote some books called the Annals, the year-by-year accounts. And this gives you a little record of what he'd done. And what I want us to see is that he, in his Annals, talks about the Christians in Rome in the year 64. Now, he's probably a young child at the time, but he's a historian who's of noble rank and that people trust for things that happened way geographically away from him and well before his time. So he lived in Rome, and he's writing about what happened in Rome when he was a child, but actually people trust him for when he describes stuff in Britain happening a long time before him or very distant from him. He's the first person to talk about the lakes, the lochs they have in Scotland, for instance. And he talks about the Great Fire in Rome, which was probably started by the mad Roman Emperor Nero. And having started a fire, that made Nero a bit less popular. So Nero wanted to become more popular, and so he blamed the Christians. And this is where Tacitus records what happened in his own hometown after this great fire in the year 64. But neither human help, nor gifts from the emperor, nor all the ways of placating heaven, that means appeasing or pleasing heaven, God, could stifle scandal or dispel the belief that the fire had taken place by order. In other words, Nero had ordered the fire. That's what people believed. Therefore, to get rid of the rumour, Nero substituted as culprits and punished with the utmost refinements of cruelty a class of men loath for their vices, whom the crowd called Christians. Christians? What are Christians? That's a weird name, isn't it? Well, I thought it'd be interesting to look at a manuscript, and of course we're going to do that, and we can just see here the word in the third line there on the left. Can I highlight it? Can I highlight it with a mouse? Is the mouse coming up there? Yeah, it's just here. See the word Christians. It looks like an I there, but there was an E before it got rubbed out. He then goes on and talks about Christus. The founder of the name had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by the sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate. And the pernicious, the nasty superstition was checked for a moment, only to break out once more, not merely in Judea, the home of the disease, but in the capital, that's Rome itself, where all things horrible or shameful in the world collect and become fashionable. So it's interesting. He talks about a group being blamed and the crowd call them Christians. He doesn't say they were called Christians or they call themselves Christians. He said the crowd call them Christians. Now, a while ago in my country, in Britain, there weren't many Muslims there. But when people talked about Muslims, at first, they called them Moslems, yeah? And then they changed the spelling to Muslims. Why? Because the more exposure they had to Muslims, the more accurate the transcription became. Now, the word Christian is actually a weird word because it goes like this. There's the Hebrew word Messiah. That comes into Greek as Christ or Christos. That goes into Latin as Christus, and then you put a Latin ending on it, you get Christian, Christianus. In other words, it's a bit foreign. So for Roman ears, who's that group they're talking about? Christians. Christians. They started the fire. You see? So what happens is, Tacitus very clearly says, the crowd call them Christians, but actually it was Christus that the name comes from. See, it's very sophisticated. And what he does, he identifies a few things that we already know from the Gospels. The person who began Christianity is Christ. And he underwent the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius. Now, Tiberius was emperor from the year 14 through to the year 37. So here we have, using a Roman historian, we can narrow down when Christ died. But actually we can do more, because he said it happened by the sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate, Well, he was in charge of Judea from the year 26 through to the year 36. So within a 10-year time frame, we can pin when Jesus was put to death without using the New Testament. And then he says also where it all happened. It started in Judea, which is what we also learn from the New Testament. And we learn that they tried to stop it, and then it broke out again. That sounds a bit like the New Testament as well. Weren't they trying to stop the belief, killing off the leader? But it broke out again, didn't it? And then it came all the way to Rome. So here we are, and Tacitus is, writing about what happened in his childhood. But here, let's say, take the year 30 as a year when Jesus may have been put to death. Here in the year 64, 34 years later, already there are Christians in Rome. In fact, he goes on and says this. That's just to give you a bit of evidence about the letter E. I won't go into that. He says, first confessed members of the sect were arrested. Next, on their disclosures, vast numbers were convicted, not so much on the hate count of arson as for hatred of the human race. It's called hate crimes. And derision accompanied their end. They were covered, that's mocking, derision. They were covered with wild beast skins and torn to death by dogs, or they were fastened on crosses and when daylight failed were burned to serve as lamps by night. Now, next, let's notice vast numbers, huge numbers of Christians in Rome within a few decades. Now, this doesn't prove Christianity is true, but it shows it spread fast, far and fast. And what that means is, one, we need to explain why it spread far and fast. Secondly, the further and the faster it spreads, the harder it is for people to be changing the Christian message as it goes along. If you're launching a PR exercise, a public relations exercise, you can't change your message halfway through and expect it to work. If Christianity is spreading fast, the Christians can't be changing the message as it's on the fly. And how would it even spread if the message weren't agreed? It wouldn't work. So that's what we get so far from Tacitus. Let's go to another Roman writer. This is a guy called Pliny. Now, he's Pliny the Younger, not his uncle, Pliny the Elder. Pliny the Elder was a great scientist. He was such a good scientist that when Vesuvius erupted in the year 79, he wanted to get super close so he could see things. That was a fatal choice. Anyway, this is his nephew, who became governor of northwest Turkey, so what's called Bithynia and Pontus, around the year 110, 112, somewhat like that. And he writes a creepy letter to the emperor, saying how wonderful the emperor is, and it's great that the emperor gives such good advice, and I just want to check I'm doing the right things with these Christians. So he says, I interrogated them, these people, as to whether they were Christians. If they confessed it, I repeated the question a second and a third time, adding the threat of capital punishment. If they still persevered, I ordered them to be led off to execution. Those who denied that they were or ever had been Christians, who repeated after me an invocation, a prayer to the gods, and offered adoration, worship, with wine and incense to your statue, that's the emperor, which I had ordered to be brought for this purpose, together with the images of the gods, and who finally cursed Christ, all things it said that no real Christian can be forced to do, I thought they should be discharged. Now he's writing to the emperor, checking that his policy is right. And he's a middle way politician, you see, middle way. Some people would say, you should kill off all the Christians. And he says, no, I'm only going to kill off those who stay as Christians. See, that's a moderate line, right? And he wants to check, that's right. And so he's got these tests for whether people are Christians or not. And what are his tests? Well, think about this. His tests are they prepared to worship the Roman gods? Are they prepared to worship the emperor? Well, hang on. How does that work as a test? That's a useless test, isn't it? Because can't you worship Christ and worship the Roman gods and worship the emperor? Duh. So how does this work? This only works because, remember, the word Christian is ultimately a term that comes from the Jews. It comes from the word Messiah, for the expected deliverer. Mathematical question here. How many gods do Jews have? One. Okay, mathematical question again. How many gods do Romans have? How many? Lots. How many gods do Greeks have? Lots. Okay? So this only works as a test if the group we're looking at has somehow kept the Jewish category that there's only one God. Right? So this is an amazing thing. We actually get bits of Christian theology coming through here. But then he talks about an informer or a document that denounced people as Christians. And he said this: others who were named by that informer at first confessed themselves to be Christians, but soon after denied it, saying that they had been, but they'd ceased 3 years ago, or many years ago, or even as much as 20 years ago. They all worshipped your statue and the images of God and cursed Christ. So here he talks about people who've given up being Christians 3 years ago, or even many years ago, even as much as 20. Now, if we're in the year 110, and we take 20 off, you know that gives you the year 90. So what he does now is he describes what these people said happened in their meetings before they'd given up being a Christian. In other words, what went on in a Christian meeting in the first century. This is what they said, the people who'd given up on the Christian faith. They affirmed, however, the whole of their guilt or error was that they were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, and they had to meet that time because, of course, slaves didn't get time off to go to church, before it was light, and of singing in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a God, and the Latin there is quasi Deo, we'll come back to that, and of binding themselves by a solemn oath, not to any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor to deny a pledge when they were called upon to deliver it up. So what went on in their Christian meetings were a lot of emphasis on honesty and fair dealing, and singing a song to Christ, quasi Deo, as to a God. Now, in Latin, there is no word a. So quasi Deo can mean as to God, as to the God. It doesn't tell you whether it's the, a, or whatever. But hang on. How many gods do Jews believe in, and haven't Christians taken over that belief? Now, this is an amazing thing, but it shows early on in Christian meetings they're treating Christ as God. Some people like the idea that at first people thought Jesus was a special human, then later a very special human, then later a very, very special human, then a very, very, very special human, and so on. And then after a few hundred years, he was halfway to God and then fully God, and it evolved over a long time. Problem: there is no evolutionary path to go from believing, that Christ is not God to believing that he is God. You know why? Because in Judaism you cannot have half gods. They don't come in halves. There's one God, and God isn't like a quality, something you can share out, not like a cake. Yeah? No, God is the creator, and everything else is the created. The creator, the created, and you can't creep across, from one category to the other over time without being noticed. It's not possible. There is no evolutionary path gradually over time, because Jews only worship one being. They only worship God. So here we realize the astounding thing that somehow these Christians are treating Jesus Christ as the God of the Jews. Now that's mind-blowing. He then goes on about what happens to these people. He says, many persons of all ages and ranks and of both sexes are being and will be called to trial. For this contagious superstition is confined not only to the cities, but is spread through the villages and rural districts. It seems possible, however, to check and correct this. It's certain, at least, that the temples, which had almost become deserted, almost empty, are now beginning to be visited again, and the sacred rites, rituals, after a long interlude, a long gap, are again being revived. There's a general demand for sacrificial animals for which up to now only rarely were purchasers found. Hang on. The governor of northwest Turkey writing to the emperor saying, so many people in my area have become Christians, it's affecting the temples. People aren't buying the sacrifices anymore. This is an astounding thing. So what we learn again from this Roman writer is that Christianity spread far and fast, and it was very difficult being a Christian. Another writer, this time a Jewish writer, someone called Josephus, and he writes a history of the entire Jewish nation, as well as a history of their war with the Romans and so on. He described a time when there's a power gap around the year 61 or 62, where there's a gap where there is no governor. And into that power gap, the high priest of Jerusalem, of the Jews, steps in. Now, this is written by Josephus, who certainly was in Jerusalem at the time. So this is remarkably close. And he says, Ananus assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before it the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when he had made an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he handed them over to be stoned. Here we have mention of Jesus and his brother called James. Now notice this, Mark chapter 6 verse 3. Jesus has a brother called James. So it's not just people who are far off who are being persuaded of Christianity. It's people who are close at hand, even family members who are being persuaded that they need to live for Jesus. This is an extraordinary thing that we see going on, and every single time it's hard. So those are three of the witnesses we have about early Christianity. Tacitus, we've got Pliny, and we've got Josephus, and they each confirm things. Now some people think, well, shouldn't there be loads and loads of sources? And they don't understand how few sources there are for anything. We don't have a lot of written sources from Israel or Palestine at the time. We just don't. I mean, the New Testament is the biggest body of literature to come from that land at the time of Jesus. You know, and it doesn't all come from that land. It's extraordinary. I mean, there is also this writer, Josephus, who writes about maybe three times worth the length of the New Testament. Then there are some Dead Sea Scrolls, mainly scraps, an odd group down by the Dead Sea. And that's it. So sometimes what people are saying is they're expecting every single thing to happen and be documented. That's as silly as asking for a whole load of documentation from the UAE 1,000 years ago. I mean, how much documentation was there about daily life written down day to day? You know, all sorts of things happen that, you know, haven't been recorded. So we've got to recognize that actually what we have about Jesus is a lot, and it's very striking. And what we have with the Gospels is we have 4 records of the life of Jesus. 4 is an incredible amount. Look, who was the most famous person alive at the time of Jesus? Well, the Roman emperor, of course, right? Tiberius, cruel guy. How many records does he have of his life? How many biographies? Well, basically 4. So that's already an amazing thing. Jesus, who just came from a nowhere town of Nazareth, has 4 accounts of his life, and the most famous guy, the Roman emperor, with all of the Senate and everything at his command, he has 4 lives. You know, 4 accounts of his life. This is extraordinary. You should be asking yourself, how come Jesus can get so many? That's amazing. Then we look at the number of words there are. And what we see is the Gospels are longer than the other ones, except for one of them called Tacitus, okay? So they're longer than Velleius Paterculus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio. But Tacitus wrote annals, which are records of what happened year by year. And I counted his words very generously, because I've counted any years that are in the reign of Tiberius as about Tiberius. But of course, a lot of the time, he was talking not about Tiberius. So you still actually end up having more about Jesus than you have about the most famous guy in the Roman Empire, the emperor himself. Then you look at when our earliest copies, manuscripts, come from. And you can see there stands for century. The earliest copies of anything about the Roman emperor come from the 9th century. They're actually biographies, whereas with the New Testament, we have manuscripts from the 3rd century and sometimes 2nd century. When were they written? In the last column, I've shown you that apart from one of them, Velleius Paterculus, the other ones were all a long time after Tiberius died. He died in the year 37, so we've got a gap of 63 years between that and the earliest record of Tacitus, 73 years for Suetonius, and more for Cassius Dio. What about the gaps between the Gospels and the life of Jesus? Well, these dates I've given for the life of Jesus, I put in italics because I don't believe them. But these are dates that other people, skeptical people, come up with, right? The skeptical people, agnostics, people like Bart Ehrman, who's an agnostic, have these dates. Jewish scholars have these sorts of dates. Even based on their dates, there's less of a gap between the records and the time of Jesus. But you say, aha! But you're cheating, because one of them, Velleius Paterculus, I can see comes from the year 30, and that's during Tiberius' reign. Quite right. And he is the least trustworthy of all. Because you know what? He's in the emperor's pay, and he only ever says nice things about the emperor, and then he mysteriously dies, and you think he might have just said something that wasn't quite pleasing to the emperor. And his account completely contradicts all the later guys. All the later guys tell you that Tiberius was pretty cruel to all his enemies and also cruel to all his friends, and he generally killed off everyone he came across. And that's the impression you get of totally mad, and so on. So in fact, what we see is the accounts we have of Jesus' life are amazing when compared with the accounts that we have of Tiberius. And by the way, none of the people who wrote the Gospels stood to gain financially. They weren't being paid by Jesus or his followers to do this. It doesn't make sense. Whereas the emperor is actually financing the propaganda of Velleius Paterculus. Now, when we come then to Galilee, most of what Jesus does is around Galilee, teaching. If you expect there to be replicas of the Gospels, other records we can check them against, there's going to be a problem, because there isn't anything. Because no other literary records, as in literature, writing, survives. Okay, bits scrawled here and there do, but actual writings, nothing. People say, well, how can we trust the Gospels? Look, most things written about football are by football enthusiasts. Most things written about golf are by golf enthusiasts. Most things written about Christ are by Christ enthusiasts. That's normal. But don't think I cannot trust any sources about football because they're written by football enthusiasts. Duh, So of course, the records we have about Jesus, the four we have, it's an amazing amount to have. We've got more than we have about the emperor at the time, but they're written by Christ enthusiasts. Now that doesn't mean you shouldn't trust them. I hope, look, if you were accused of a terrible crime and dragged to court, I hope if you said in your defense, well look, these are the reasons I'm innocent, they wouldn't dismiss your argument and say, well, you would say that because you're enthusiastic about the idea of your own innocence. Just because someone is biased in the sense that they are concerned about something doesn't mean what they're saying is untrue. So we're going to look at these records. But first, I want to make an argument about how we can show something to be trustworthy. And for this, I want to go to the Old Testament. Because I know you thought you were coming to something just on the Gospels. I'm going to sneak in some Old Testament. The way this works is I start with an old page. Anyone have an idea what this is an old page of? Anyone? Call out, sorry? It's a Bible? Any sort of Bible? Sorry? Gutenberg, not Gutenberg, but it's up close, anyone? It's a King James Bible from 1611. This is my bit of British monarchy, which is, I thought I'd bring along. King James Bible. And it's written in old-ish English. But this is 2 Kings chapter 18. And what we find here is an account of how the king Sennacherib from Assyria comes up and besieges. And I'm going to read it because I want you not only to learn my English, but also the English of 400 years ago. So it's hard to read, but I'm going to try and read it slowly. Now, in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, did Sennacherib, king of Assyria, that's an S, come up, that's a U, against all the fenced cities of Judah and took them. Fenced means walled, got a wall around them. And Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent to the king of Assyria, to Lachish, saying, I have offended, I've done something wrong. Return from me, that means, please go away. That which thou puttest on me will I bear, which means whatever you find me, I will pay. And the king of Assyria appointed unto Hezekiah, king of Judah, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. He said, that is the fine dude. Okay, 30 talents of gold, 300 talents of silver. And what did Hezekiah do? Verse 15, Hezekiah gave him all the silver that was found in the house of the Lord, the temple, and in the treasures of the king's house. That means in the palace. So Sennacherib fined him 300 talents of silver, 30 talents of gold, and his response is to give all of the silver in the palace and in the temple. Did that just happen to correspond to 300? Well, the interesting thing about that is that it's very old, and we can take out historical details. Here are some more. The king of Assyria sent Tartan and Rabsaris and Rabshakeh from Lachish to King Hezekiah with a great host, a great army against Jerusalem. And they went up and they came to Jerusalem. And when they were come up, they came and stood by the conduit, that's a water channel, of the upper pool, which is by the highway, the road of the fuller's field. That's someone who washes clothes. Why all these details? Why are you telling us these details? Well, put these things together, you have a number of claims in the text. Namely, there was a Judean king called Hezekiah. All the fortified cities of Judah were captured, all except for Jerusalem. This was done by Sennacherib, who was king of Assyria. Sennacherib particularly fought against Lachish. Hezekiah was fined 30 talents of gold, 300 of silver, and he gave all of the silver in the king's house and the temple. Why should I care? Because of this guy, Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, we have a thing about him in Britain. Napoleon Bonaparte was the person who began archaeology. When he conquered Egypt, invaded Egypt, he took expert scientists with him, with his army, 1799. So I've shown you a Bible and we've read it from 1611, but archaeology doesn't begin till 1799. So what that means is, in that old Bible, there could be no input of knowledge from archaeology. You get it? So very easily we can find old Bibles and we can read them. You can get hold of them and you can find out they've got all sorts of things that humans knew before they dug things out of the ground. It was only after archaeology began that people then deciphered Egyptian. I'm afraid that was done by a Frenchman. He beat the English guy to it in 1822. And then they decipher Assyrian in the 1850s. And guess what they find? They find that all sorts of things mentioned in the Bible are confirmed by the Assyrian records. If you had asked a monk in the Middle Ages copying a Latin Bible, what are the names of the 5 Assyrian kings mentioned in the Bible, he would have told you who they were and when they lived, and he's been shown to be right. The 5 Assyrian kings, in that order, have their things deciphered. Tiglath-Pileser, Shalmaneser, Sargon, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon. This is phenomenal. The Bible gets these things right. And also, there's even a record, there are 3 copies of this, where Sennacherib records how he besieged Jerusalem in the time of Hezekiah. And this is what he says. This is Sennacherib's own account that was dug up and then deciphered. As for Hezekiah the Judean, I besieged 46 of his fortified, walled cities. Notice that same phrase, walled cities. I conquered them and took out 200,150 people. He himself I locked up within Jerusalem, his royal city, like a bird in a cage. Now this is what's called political spin, because he didn't conquer Jerusalem. So how can you put positively, I didn't conquer Jerusalem, like this? I shut him up like a bird in a cage. See, it's a bit more positive than I failed. Hezekiah was overwhelmed by the splendor of my lordliness, and he sent me 30 talents of gold, 800 talents of silver. Now, what was in the Bible? What were the numbers? 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. Now, this is fascinating, because I am far more struck by the fact that the numbers agree on the gold than the fact they're different on the silver. Because this, to me, is an astounding thing. Because how does the Bible and the Old Testament come down to us? Well, here we're talking about what's happening around the year 700 BC. Keep that number in mind. It's actually 701, but 700 will do, okay? The earliest copy that people had when they made the King James Bible of the Old Testament in Hebrew was the 11th century AD. In other words, there are 1800 years of copy. Things just people get copied down. And you know how easy it is to miscopy a number? You miscopy a phone number and it's pretty hard to phone someone. Yeah? So in all of those years, if people were badly copying, that wouldn't get passed down, would it? But it has been, and it's amazing. And then it's in the King James Version in the 17th century, all that information from so much earlier. And this is an argument from vindicated trust, because if I'd asked a monk in the Middle Ages, well, how many talents of gold did Hezekiah pay to Sennacherib? They would have looked up in the Bible, if they didn't have it in their head, and they would have said, well, of course, it's 30. What about the difference on the silver? Well, of course, notice in the Bible, it says he was told he had to pay 300, but he actually gave all of the silver in the palace and the temple. Why? Because he wants him to go away, and it's a risk. It's a real risk, okay? The problem is this. Big guy is besieging you. You give him your money. What guarantee do you have he's actually going to go away at all? You don't have any. So it's a really risky thing. So in all of this, I think I've got good evidence that the Bible is shown to be trustworthy. There's a bit more. Remember that man called Tartan? He was one of the chief officials. Now, the language hadn't even been deciphered until 1850. People decipher it, Akkadian language, and they look, and goodness, Tartan is a real word. Tartano means a principal military officer, the commander-in-chief. It makes sense. So in fact, and Rab and all this sort of, you know the word Rab because it's in Arabic as well, but it's also part of Akkadian, is there. So what's so surprising? The surprising thing is that we have information passed over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And that's with the Old Testament. Now the gap of time is far, far, far shorter with the Gospels. So in fact, we have an argument from vindicated trust. People in the past, people who died for their faith as Christians, trusted that the Old Testament was reliable, that the Bible was reliable, and we've seen their trust has been something very rational. There are lots of other kings mentioned in the Old Testament as well, kings of Egypt, Assyria, Moab, and so on. So you have people from the Old Testament mentioned in other records, and then you have other records mentioned in the Old Testament. Now this is an astounding thing, because think about this. Often people say, I want you to show me that, say, the Old Testament is true, not using the Old Testament. Okay? It's a bit like saying, I want to look at the national history of Israel without using their main literature. I want to look at the history of the USA without using any source that comes from within the USA. Really? Imagine doing that with Egypt. We're going to do Egyptian history without looking at any sources that come from Egypt. Pretty crazy. But that's often what people are trying to do. So what happens if we apply these tests to the Gospels? The Gospels, recognizing the 4 Gospels are our only sources for what we're going to learn about Jesus and his teaching, we look in them and we start seeing, and we'll see far more in the next session after the break, how good their information is. I wrote a little book about it, but we can look at the subject of their corroboration. Let's look at, are there things in the Gospels which other things may be subtly fit with? For instance, Josephus doesn't tell us much about Jesus, but he tells us something about John the Baptist. And he tells this story about when Herod had an army that was destroyed. And this is what Josephus reports. Now, some of the Jews thought the destruction of Herod, that's Herod Antipas, Herod's army, came from God as a just punishment for what he'd done to John, who was called the Baptist. For Herod killed him, though he was a good man, and commanded the Jews to practice virtue, showing righteousness towards one another and piety towards God, and to come together for baptism. The baptism would be acceptable to God, to him, if they were not using it to put away sins, but for the purification of the body when the soul had already been purified beforehand by righteousness. Let me unpack that. Remember in the New Testament that John the Baptist says, repent and be baptized. Repentance comes first, baptism comes next. This is how Josephus puts John the Baptist's message. Get the soul ready first, then purify the body. You see? Purification of the body when the soul had already been purified by righteousness. In other words, it's the same message. Now, when others came crowding round, and the Gospels talk about the crowds with John the Baptist, for they were very pleased by hearing his words, Herod was afraid that the great influence John had over the people might lead to rebellion, since they seemed ready to do whatever he advised. Therefore, he thought it far better to take him and kill him before any trouble arose from him, and than to have regrets if trouble arose. So, through Herod's suspicion, he, that's John the Baptist, was sent as a prisoner to Machaerus, the aforementioned castle, and was killed there. Now, what's weird in this account? It's a bit different from the Gospels. What we notice is this. The same thing goes on as in the Gospels, that you have a man who preaches, who gets imprisoned and then executed. Well, it has to happen in that order, really, doesn't it? But it's the same person responsible for the execution, and this person teaches John the Baptist with authority, and he baptizes. The same message about baptism. But there's something more striking. Josephus tells us that Herod had married and then divorced someone called Phasaelis. Now, the problem about this is that Phasaelis was the daughter of the neighbouring king of the Nabateans, Aretas IV. And then, after divorcing this woman, the king's daughter, he married Herodias, wife of his brother Philip. Now, then, Josephus tells us people thought the destruction of Herod's army was because of John the Baptist. But that doesn't make any sense. Why would anyone connect the destruction of an army with the death of John the Baptist? I mean, isn't that a bit random? You know, why couldn't it be something else? But think about this. The Gospels tell us that in the New Testament, John the Baptist condemned Herod's marriage to Herodias. That's why Herodias hated John the Baptist and wanted his head cut off. So in other words, what we have is we have 2 accounts that are each giving us part of the story, and together we understand far more. So in fact, we find these accounts dovetail. This is what we get with trustworthy accounts, that truth is being told. We can explain the most by simply saying it's true. I'm going to end shortly, time for a break, but I want to give you one more example. And this comes from, a couple more examples. One is Jesus' shortest parable. Jesus' shortest parable is just 15 words in Luke, 19 words in Matthew. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven, yeast, that a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour until it was all leavened. That's it. You ask yourself the question, how can I possibly know whether Jesus said that? I mean, it's just something short. how can I know he said it? Well, I can't prove he said it, but I can tell you this. In that short phrase, the word for measure is a local measure. It comes from the land. It's a Jewish expression, the sarton, the seah. And dry measures differ from country to country. So take currency as an example. In the US they use the dollar, and in Britain they use the pound, and he used the dirham. Okay? They vary from place to place. The way people measure things varies from place to place. Some people use feet and inches. Some people use meters. There are different systems. Cubits, some cultures used. So what we realize is this is reporting language which only someone from that area would use. Can I prove it comes from Jesus? I can say coming from Jesus gives you the simplest explanation for what we have. Here's another example from a passage just before the one I spoke on this morning at church, where Jesus tells a story of an unjust manager. And the unjust manager tries to get favor with people by letting them off their debts. And he says to one in Luke 16, verse 6, how much do you owe? He said, 100 baths of oil. That's a liquid measure. Next verse, he asks another guy, how much do you owe? 100 cores of wheat. That's a solid measure. Those are both measures that were only used in the country by the Jews and not by Jews in other countries or anywhere else. So they fit locally. Then he goes on, and Jesus says in the story that the master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness, for the sons of this world are more shrewd than dealing than their own generation, than the sons of light. And that phrase, sons of light, was only known from the New Testament until the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. And then they found, it's a phrase from there. In other words, it's a local phrase. And then in the next verse, Jesus says, so I tell you, make friends for yourself by means of unrighteous mammon. And mammon is a particular Jewish word for money that was used only in that land. In other words, we've got 4 verses in a row where we have language that only someone from that country would know and use, and it appears as part of a coherent story. So unless we're going to say a committee made up the story, the simplest thing is to say the whole lot goes back to Jesus, you see? So I think you've listened very patiently. I don't think it's time for questions now. It's time for break, isn't it? So thank you for listening, and reassemble in 7 minutes? 5 minutes.